Before tonight's horrors unfold, drop a comment and let us know where in the world you're tuning in from. Your support keeps the horrors alive. Let's begin. I don't think anyone ever actually gets over traumatic events. Not really, anyway. Sure, you can compartmentalize things, push back memories, develop coping skills, but the damage is already done. It's like trying to smooth out a piece of paper after you've crumpled it. You can get it back into a condition to write on, but you can never remove the creases. It has been 26 years since the car accident, but I still can remember the sound of squealing scream of metal on metal, the crunch of bone and shattered glass. I was only 7 years old at the time. It was a minor miracle that I wasn't hurt. I guess those booster seats really do help in the event of a collision. My father wasn't so lucky, however. I'm told he died almost instantly. Almost. My family, once three, now two, wasn't especially wealthy, and between the loss of my father's income and the devastating cost of my mother's stay in the hospital, we fell from lower middle class to destitute in a matter of months. I remember celebrating my 8th birthday with my mother in crutches, and my friends left behind a couple towns over, eating chocolate cake in a half-furnished apartment which smelled of roach droppings. I didn't fully understand death at that point. It had never really been something that came up until the accident. There had never been any relatives who passed away. My family had been relatively careful to keep me away from violent TV shows and the like. They wanted to raise me to have a happy, carefree childhood, to be a happy girl who would grow up to be a happy woman. I didn't realize for a long time how much it must have hurt my mother whenever I asked her when Daddy would be coming back from the hospital. I'd seen his body being taken away in an ambulance, and I was old enough to know ambulances took people to the hospital, to the place where people are made better. I just assumed they were taking an extra long time with my father. Fortunately, kids have short memories, and eventually I stopped asking. My mother was left relatively uninjured from the crash, at least in terms of broken bones and the like. There was a cracked rib, a minor concussion, and a broken leg, but all that healed fairly quickly. It was the nerve damage that left her permanently disabled. She was constantly racked with all-consuming, aching pain, like the sensation a sprinter feels after being pushed past their limit. She was tired all the time, and sometimes didn't even have the energy to get up and make us breakfast. 8 years old, and I had to prepare breakfast for my own mother. She was prescribed some pretty heavy painkillers by the doctors, so at first things weren't too bad. When she was taking her medicine, she was a little bit out of it. She once poured soy sauce on my pancakes instead of maple syrup. But she was at least active and fairly happy. When the meds wore off, however, I could hear her sobbing from the agony through the thin walls of the cheap apartment, her cries of pain mixing with the ambient hum of distant traffic. The medical industry isn't designed to handle chronic illness. The underlying assumption behind hospitals is that the patients there will eventually get better and will no longer require extensive care. The goal is to transform sick and/or injured individuals into relatively healthy ones. The prohibitive costs of hospital stays, medications, consultations, and other expenses ensure that only the chronically ill who are quite rich are able to get the care that they need to stay functional. My mother was not, by any stretch of the imagination, rich. Unable to hold a job anymore, she had to rely on disability benefits and insurance payouts. Before long, funds dried up for regular physical therapy and other treatments. Some doctor decided the best course of action to treat my mother's pain would be to gradually wean her off of the painkillers. However, at this point, she had already long since become addicted. Eventually, when the pharmacist would no longer fill her prescription, things got really bad at home for me. I didn't fully understand what was happening at the time, just that my mother needed medicine, and the doctors wouldn't give it to her. Have you ever seen someone going through withdrawals? Whenever I hear people talk about how irresponsible addicts are, how they should just quit cold turkey, I want to slap them across the face. She was shivering all the time, could barely even move, just spent all her time vomiting and crying. It's horrifying to see your mother be so weak when you're just a child. At that point in your life, you're so small, so vulnerable, and to see the person who was supposed to protect and take care of you be reduced to a twitching mass of vomit-stained blankets and tears feels like the scariest thing in the world. Sometimes she would get violent. She would throw things and scream. There was a sort of primal hatred in her voice, an anger mixed with loss and fear and pain. It never lasted long, and I would usually hide in the closet, plugging my ears and counting down from 100 to distract myself, like I was playing a game of hide and seek. She still managed to pull herself together just enough to buy groceries, and I'm grateful for that. One day she came back from her shopping, and she seemed back to normal again, or at least what I had come to understand as normal for her, that half-asleep contentment that came after a dose of medicine. There were less groceries, however, perhaps half as much food. I asked her, "Mommy, did the doctors change their mind? Did they give you more medicine?" She smiled at me, her eyes seeming a million miles away. "Yes, sweetie, I met a nice doctor who gave me some medicine." I hugged her legs, happy that she had met the nice doctor, that things would be okay again. It took a bit of time for me to adjust to the lower amount of food. My mother's doctor required a hefty fee for the medicines he provided, and that took its toll on the groceries. I know that my mother took the worst of it. She didn't want to starve her child because of her addiction after all, but I still felt the effects. I began to lose weight, my ribs started to show. I tried to hide it from her. I knew how much she needed her medicine, and frankly, I was scared of how she would act without it. I knew she was giving me most of the food because she was getting skinnier all the time, even more so than me. Sometimes I thought she looked like a skeleton. This went on for some months. I had to get sent to the nurse's office at school a couple of times because of fainting during PE class. They told me that I had low blood sugar because I wasn't eating enough. I recall at the time I thought that was a very silly thing for them to say because I'd gotten cuts before and had sucked on the wounds to make them feel better, and the blood never tasted sweet to me, even before I had less to eat. I got put into a program that have poor kids free school lunches, and it helped a little bit. I didn't faint anymore, at least. My mother's new medicine came in a different form from the old, but it seemed to work a lot better. She would have to tie her elastic yoga band around her arm and poke herself with a needle, like when I would go to the doctor to get my flu shot. My mother never complained about the pain, but she was out of it a lot more often. Sometimes she would lay on the couch for hours, just staring up at the ceiling, smiling faintly. I was playing over at a friend's house one day when I first learned the word heroin. I say she was a friend, but realistically, I barely knew the girl. We just talked sometimes at school. In retrospect, I think that a lot of the parents at school felt sorry for me and made their kids spend time with me out of pity. I was telling my friend about how my mommy had to take special medicine because of her nerve pain and how she got it from a friendly doctor, but that the medicine was expensive and so that's why I was skinny, since we couldn't afford a lot of food. My friend looked at me with wide eyes and said, "That's not medicine, Amber. Those are drugs. Your mom is doing heroin. You should call the police on her." I didn't really know how to react. I'd heard vaguely of drugs before, but didn't know exactly what they were or what they did. All I knew is sometimes some of the older kids would talk about smoking weeds or would grind up candy into a powder and snort it up their nose as a joke. I laughed along with them because everyone else laughed, but I didn't know what it meant. I changed the subject to what cartoons we liked, and the topic of my mother's medicine wasn't brought up again. It was on my 9th birthday that my mother came home from her appointment to get medicine empty-handed. She had said she left that she would bring a cake home on the way back. She slammed the door loudly and screamed out a series of words I didn't know the meaning of, but had learned long ago I wasn't supposed to say. They were words meant only for grown-ups. Fucking motherfucker, piece of shit, cocksucker, fuck. She kicked one of my stuffed animals I had left laying on the floor, and it hit the wall with a soft thump. I wanted to ask her what happened, but I was too scared, so I just stared at her, starting to cry. She told me to go to my room, to go away, and I did. I hid in the closet and hoped she would calm down, counting down from 100 and then whispering vaguely to God to ask him to make my mother not hurt anymore. I didn't really know much about praying. My mother and I didn't go to church, but I'd absorbed enough of the concept from movies and kids at school that I had a general idea of what sort of words I was supposed to say. I knew I had to hold my hands together like I was mid-clap and someone paused time. After a few hours, my mother came into my room and opened the closet door, picking me up gently and sitting me down on her knee on the bed. She told me she was sorry for swearing at me and that it wasn't my fault, that I hadn't done anything wrong. She said that her doctor had moved away, and so she wasn't able to get her medicine anymore. I told her I was sorry. It was too late to get a cake, but she made waffles with lots of maple syrup, and it was almost as good. The next week or so was rough. I didn't get to have a birthday party. My mother was going into withdrawals again and couldn't focus well enough to organize that sort of event. We had more money than usual because she didn't have any more medicine to buy. But my mother was too sick to go grocery shopping, so in the end, it didn't really matter. One day I brought in the mail from the mailbox at my mother's request. She said the light was too bright for her to go outside and that it would give her a headache. There was the usual plethora of official-looking envelopes and garish junk mail. But one thing in particular caught my eye. It was just a folded sheet of blank paper, and written on it in scratchy lettering were the words, "I have what you need. Leave your bedroom window unlocked." Taped to the letter was a small plastic bag containing a brownish powder. I wanted to throw away the note. I didn't know what it meant, but from the moment I read it, I felt a deep pit open up in my stomach. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I felt as though I was being watched hungrily, like I was a mouse tossed into the cage of a starving viper. Ultimately, I folded the letter back up and handed it to my mother. I'd heard one of the other kids at school talk about how tampering with someone else's mail was a federal offense, and I didn't want to go to jail. My understanding of the legal system was, as with most 9-year-olds, less than comprehensive. I still feel guilty about giving her the note, instead of just tearing it up and disposing of it. I know I can't be blamed for what happened. I was just a kid, but still I lie awake at night sometimes wondering if it could have turned out differently. About an hour after I'd given her the note, my mother called for me to come out of my room. I did so obediently, and she informed me that I was going to stay over at a friend's house that evening and that I should pack some pajamas and my toothbrush. She was smiling and had that air of hazy contentment that indicated she had recently taken her medicine. I did as I was told, and a couple of hours later, I was staying with another loose acquaintance from school. Like most of my sleepovers, it was awkward, but ultimately uneventful. I don't really remember much except that there was some animated movie playing on the boxy television. It was nearly 3 a.m. and I couldn't sleep, but I was too tired to focus on, so I just watched the patterns of light from the screen dance around the darkened room. When I came back home, my mother wasn't in pain, with the same foggy air of happiness and contentment as before. I knew she'd gotten a new doctor. I asked her if we wouldn't have enough money for food, since she would have to pay for her medicine again. She told me, "No, Amber, it's all right. Mommy has found a doctor who will give her medicine for free. I just have to do him a few favors." She held me close, and I was very happy that things seemed to be turning out all right. But I couldn't help but notice that her hands felt much colder than usual. I began to get sent off to sleepovers on an almost weekly basis, sometimes more often than that. I asked my mother why this was, and she told me that her doctor needed to come over to the apartment to give her checkups, and so I needed to be out of the house. I was worried about what kind of checkups her doctor was giving her. Whenever I came home from a sleepover, my mother seemed to be happy, the pain gone, but she was getting increasingly thin and pale, even more skeletal than she looked before. Despite our increased food, her cheeks were sunken in, her eyes had massive dark bags under them. She'd taken to wearing long sleeve shirts all the time. She looked so much older than she ought to. I remember I was at a group sleepover once, and I told the other girls about my mother's new doctor, how she got medicine for free in exchange for her just doing favors. One of them giggled. It was the friend who told me the word heroin. When Amber says medicine, what she means is, she lowered her voice to a whisper, drugs. Amber's mommy is a druggie. Another girl laughed and said, maybe she's a prostitute. I asked her what that word meant, and that sent everyone into a fit of hysterics. Some of the girls were a little older than me, and sometimes talked about things that I didn't understand, but made me feel deeply uncomfortable. Like I was overhearing some sort of forbidden knowledge, heresies not meant for my young ears. She managed to stop laughing for long enough to explain, giggling between each word. A prostitute is a lady who touches guys' private parts for money, or sometimes for drugs. After saying this, she burst out into uncontrollable laughter, and everyone else joined in. I felt embarrassed, dirty, and my face flushed red. I didn't talk for the rest of the evening, and everyone else at the sleepover saw fit to ignore me. My mother kept getting thinner and thinner, more and more pale. I had a nightmare once that she got so thin that she just peeled off her skin and turned into an animate skeleton, walking around like a puppet without strings. In the dream, everyone at school laughed at me for having a skeleton mommy. I was at yet another sleepover when the host broke her leg on a little trampoline she had in her living room. I was driven home by her father, despite my protestations that my mother's doctor was still giving a checkup, and soon found myself back at the front door of the apartment. I used the spare key that was hidden underneath the welcome mat and walked inside. All the lights were off, and it was late at night, so I couldn't see much of anything. I guessed that maybe the doctor had gone back to the hospital. I assumed that doctors slept in hospitals, just like how I thought teachers slept in classrooms. I didn't want to wake my mother, so I padded softly towards my room on tiptoe, trying my best to be as quiet as possible. As I reached the hallway, however, I heard a strange noise coming from behind my mother's bedroom door. It was an odd groaning sound, like the sound an elderly person might make when getting up from a rocking chair. I was worried about if maybe my mother was hurting again, or that perhaps she had fallen over in the night and hit her head. I crept toward the door, trying my utmost to be as silent as possible. As I got closer, the sounds became more distinct, and the more I heard, the more uncomfortable I became. The groans were low and strange, but not painful like I had initially assumed. There had been a movie on the TV I had watched once, before the accident that killed my father and permanently injured my mother, one that had a sex scene. I didn't know that's what it was at the time, of course. To my young mind, it was just two people writhing in bed together, naked, making odd noises. It was almost funny, but it made me uncomfortable. It felt like something I wasn't meant to see. My mother shut the TV off as soon as she saw me watching, and told me that that sort of thing was for grown-ups, that I was too young to understand. The sounds from behind that door reminded me of the noises the two grown-ups under the covers had been making on the TV. I pushed open the door just a crack, hoping that the hinges wouldn't creak. Few people can point to a specific moment in their life where their previous understanding of the world utterly shattered, an event that changed everything forever. Even the car accident hadn't done that. Even moving into a dirty roach-infested apartment hadn't done that. Even watching my own mother shoot up heroin in front of me hadn't done that. What I saw behind that door killed every ounce of innocence I had left. The window to the bedroom was open, the curtains fluttering in the cool night breeze. A full moon shone through the opening, illuminating the otherwise darkened room. Laying on the bed was my mother, skeletal, moaning. Naked, crouched on top of her, was something out of a nightmare. It was dressed in clothes that seemed a century out of date, with a white high-collared shirt and a worn black leather duster. Sitting next to it on the bed was an old-fashioned doctor's bag, the moonlight glinting off of the syringes and other bits of paraphernalia held within. The thing's face was monstrous. The skin was pallid and corpse-like, the mouth full of jagged teeth like bits of glass jabbed into exposed gums, the eyes reflective in the dim light like those of a cat's. From its open mouth, a thin, snake-like tongue jabbed into one of my mother's bloody exposed track marks, sucking up dope-infused blood like a mosquito's proboscis. I wet myself as I watched this nightmarish incubus drink my mother's lifeblood, but I did not scream. Why would I? We screamed to call for help, to try and attract the attention of those we trust. The only person in the world who I trusted to protect me from monsters was currently underneath one of them, moaning in pleasure as its tongue slithered into her veins. As though sleepwalking in a trance, I walked into my bedroom and hid in the closet. I don't know how, but I must have fallen asleep at some point, and I woke to the sound of my alarm clock going off. I got up in a daze. I think I assumed the night's events must have been some terrible dream, despite the stale scent of drying urine from my stained pajamas indicating otherwise. I went to my mother's bedroom and opened the door, planning on waking her up as per usual. She lay face up in the bed, eyes open, completely still. She didn't even breathe. "Mommy, it's time to wake up." A fly landed on her eye. She didn't blink. I was told by countless psychiatrists and therapists that my memory of the crouching thing that had killed my mother must be a result of the trauma of losing both parents at such a young age. My child's mind invented a monster to explain away the very real horror of my mother dying from a heroin overdose when I was only 9 years old. It took a lot of convincing, but eventually I came to believe it. I was adopted by my paternal grandparents, who did their best to raise me despite their old age, and overall things could have turned out much worse for me. I managed to lead a relatively normal life, despite the occasional night terrors that ended in me waking up with a scream, the bed drenched through with sweat. I'm 33 years old now. I've been married, though it ended in a messy divorce. I live in a fairly decent apartment and have an office job that pays relatively well. Despite the events of my childhood, my parents ultimately got what they wanted. Their daughter is living a very normal life. I wouldn't even be writing down this story if it wasn't for one thing that happened recently, something that makes me question everything all those shrinks ever told me, something that makes all the coping mechanisms in journaling and talking out my feelings under sterile fluorescent lights feel like bullshit. My grandmother passed away recently. It wasn't too much of a shock. My grandfather had already died a few years back, and I knew they could never bear to be apart for too long. I was looking through all her old things, especially old documents and the like, getting her affairs in order and figuring out inheritance and whatnot. It wasn't anything particularly pleasant, but it was one of those things you just have to do. While I was flipping through various mold-stained folders, I noticed a certain document that caught my eye amidst the endless parade of half-clipped coupon books, old recipes, and cash checks. It was a death certificate, my mother's death certificate. I looked through the file with an odd mix of nostalgia and trauma. I tried not to think too much about her death anymore. It didn't help to dwell on the past, but something made me read through it. A feeling deep in my gut told me I had to. Eventually I found it, that little piece of information that changed everything. All my life I'd been told my mother died from a heroin overdose. It's what the cops said, it's what my therapist said, it's what my grandparents said. Hell, if you'd have asked me a few days ago how she died, it's what I would have said. But the cause of death listed on the certificate said blood loss.